A bipartisan group of senators are pressuring President Trump to investigate the disappearance of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. But the president has not sounded completely convinced about doing so.
I am concerned about it. I don't like hearing about it.
Well, I have to find out who did it. But people saw him go in, but they didn't see him come out, as they understand it. And we're going to take a very serious look at it.
Well, it's a terrible thing, and it certainly would not be a positive. I would not be happy at all.
All right, joining me now is CNN senior political reporter Nia Malika Henderson and former federal prosecutor and CNN chief legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin. Guys, this is just as chilling as it gets, the details of what journalists have found from unnamed Turkish sources about what happened after Jamal Khashoggi went into the consulate. But it's complicated for all of the reasons of the geopolitics of it between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, the ripple effect with Iran and Yemen, and then the interpersonal complications of the Trump family and this crown prince. Jared Kushner has become very close to this Saudi crown prince, who many believe somehow ordered this hit on Jamal Khashoggi, if that's in fact what happened. In fact, here is how it plays out, Nia. This is what, according to the New York Times, Kushner championed Prince Mohammed, who was 33, when the prince was jockeying to be his father's heir, had dinner with him in Washington and Riyadh, the Saudi capital, promoted a $110 billion weapons sale to his military, and once even hoped the future king would put a Saudi stamp of approval on his Israeli-Palestinian peace plan. Nia, it couldn't be more intertwined.
That's right.
Personal and
that's right. And
international.
Yeah, and there's some reporting that there have been conversations, not recently, but between Kushner and the Crown Prince that weren't necessarily captured, that he didn't get the correct briefings before he had those conversations. So yes, this is incredibly complicated. It's also complicated by the fact that this is a president who has been very mindful of essentially ignoring human rights abuses. He went before the UN just last month and said, listen, you can do what you want to do as long as the U.S. You recognize the U.S.'s sovereignty, we will recognize your sovereignty too. And when he went to Saudi Arabia in May of 2017, he also said that he wasn't there to lecture them. But guess what? I mean, this is what U.S. presidents have typically done in terms of human rights abuses. And Saudi Arabia is one of the most repressive regimes in the world when you think about how they treat women, kids, people who are foreigners, people who aren't Muslim. And this is a place where the U.S. under this president just hasn't wanted to go in terms of talking about these abuses. So we'll see what this president does in terms of this issue. He's obviously getting pressure already from folks, a bipartisan effort from senators to say, look into this, pressure this regime for transparency. And then if something is proven that they actually did order this killing, this hit on this journalist, then you'd have to put some sanctions on this regime.
You know, one view of the Middle East is that it is divided between Saudi allies and Iranian allies. And we have very much embraced Saudi Arabia as a check on Iran, also as a potential partner of Israel, although unspoken, in that part of the conflict. If Saudi Arabia makes itself unsupportable by its behavior in this way, to say nothing of its use of executions of political prisoners and just incredibly repressive politics, it just throws our effort completely into disarray, which, you know, was Jared Kushner's principal achievement. So,
a former ambassador to Yemen says that because of all of this, all of these complications and all of these personal and political ties, that perhaps Saudi Arabia now feels emboldened to do things like this. Here's the quote. It does seem like the Saudis are less concerned about U.S. views than ever before, both because they assume Trump won't care and because they think they don't need U.S. approval. And so enter in these senators, Nia, who are trying to get the president to care.
Yeah, and again, this is a bipartisan group of senators who are really trying to put this on the president's radar. So far, he's essentially said, oh, he'll be mad if he finds out that something went wrong here. We don't know what kind of conversation this administration is having with the Saudi Arabians, with the Crown Prince. Is Kushner, for instance, pressuring his good friend, the Crown Prince there, to give him details about what happened, to give him information about what happen. I think this also points to a kind of flaw in terms of the way this president approaches foreign policy, which is to say that sort of friendships can somehow change things, right? I mean, for instance, this friendship with the Crown Prince that Kushner has, the friendship that the president now has with the dictator of North Korea, hasn't necessarily changed things materially, and we'll see if any way this friendship that has been developed comes into play and puts pressure on Saudi Arabia to give up information about what happened to this journalist.
One more complication. So the president was asked if he would consider sanctions, if he would consider blocking arms sales to Saudi Arabia. This was on Fox yesterday, so let me just play for you what his response was to that.
What about the senators, a bipartisan kind of talk now that they would block any further arms sales to Saudi? Would you support that?
Well, I think that would be hurting us. Frankly, I think that would be a very, very tough pill to swallow for our country.
Would that be a tough pill?
Well, I mean, you know, when the president made his first foreign trip to Saudi Arabia last May, his big announcement was that Saudi was going to buy $110 billion worth of American military equipment. That number was clearly exaggerated, but there was substantial arms sales involved, which the president touted as essentially as a jobs bill. Like, look at all the jobs it will create, rather than whether Saudi Arabia really should have all those weapons. As you can tell from the president's answer, he's still very reluctant to give up on those arms sales, in part because of the economic impact those jobs have, you know, here in the United States.
Okay, let's move on to the First Lady, because she's also making news. She's on an international trip, as you know, Nia, and so she was asked about everything that happened with Brett Kavanaugh, about the women who have come forward, about whether or not women should be believed. Here is what Melania Trump says about that.
I support the women, and they need to be heard. We need to support them. And, you know, also men, not just women. I do stand with women, but we need to show the evidence. You cannot just say to somebody, I was, you know, sexually assaulted, or you did that to me, or because sometimes the media goes too far.
So, Nia, I mean, she's saying a few different things there. She's saying that women really need to produce hard evidence, and I'm just wondering, what would the hard evidence be of someone trying to rip off your bathing suit and covering your mouth so you couldn't scream more than 30 years ago?
I am going to defer to Nia. I have no idea what she's talking about. Nia, you're in charge of answering that question.
Right. I don't know either. I mean, she's all over the place. They're saying she supports the women, but she supports the men. She probably believes what Don Jr. believes, which is that there is this attempt to get men. And obviously her husband, she might think, is also a victim of this Me Too culture. I think it was 13 women so far have accused him of sexual harassment, of sexual assault, of any number of infractions. And, you know, the interesting thing, I think the follow-up question to her would be, well, what about these 13 women who've said these number of things about your husband? What do you think about that? So, you know, I mean, I think what's also interesting about her is we often think that she is in some ways out to poke her husband, is independent from her husband. But I think in the main areas, whether it's birtherism, whether it's Me Too, whether it's that Access Hollywood tape, she has been his biggest defender, and I think we see that there in that interview.
What Nia said.
I knew that. You're passing this one right over to Nia. Got it. Jeffrey, Nia, thank you very much. Okay, President Trump penned an op-ed for USA Today and took on Medicare for all, but his arguments have fact-checkers working overtime, like our own CNN senior political analyst John Avlon, here with a reality check. What have you found, John?
Well, let me tell you, Ali. So yesterday, USA Today published this op-ed by President Trump titled, "Democrats' Medicare for All plan will demolish promises to seniors." Now, normally, it's just an honor to run a piece from the president, but normally, columns are fact-checked, even from the president. And that's where things fell apart fast here, because if the president says something, that might make it news, but that doesn't mean it's true. As the Washington Post fact-checker Glenn Kessler wrote, quote, almost every sentence contained a misleading statement or a falsehood. PolitiFact took it to the woodshed as well, as did NPR, the LA Times, and many other outlets. Now, to be clear, there are plenty of rational reasons to oppose Senator Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All bill. Too bad the president didn't take that path. Let's start with his core claim that Medicare for All would gut seniors' benefits. In fact, the plan would expand seniors' existing coverage to include dental, vision, and hearing aids while eliminating deductibles. Over time, it would try to expand this to all Americans. The real problem is, you guessed it, the cost. Some $36 trillion over 10 years. But Trump has little moral authority when it comes to deficit and the debt. His trillions in tax cuts and big government budgets have created $1 trillion deficits for the foreseeable future. And while Trump hates Obamacare, which, lest we forget, was based on a conservative Heritage Foundation proposal, he likes to say that he will protect the popular parts of the bill. Back to the op-ed. Quote, I promised we would protect coverage for patients with pre-existing conditions and create new health care insurance options that would lower premiums. But he's done the opposite. His administration has taken steps to gut affordable coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. He's tried to destabilize Obamacare markets by removing the individual mandate that helped contain costs for private sector providers, and even scheduled maintenance for many hours on Obamacare portals during open enrollment periods for the last 2 years. Or, as the USA editorial board said back in July, quote, Trump is determined to kill Obamacare in darkness. Finally, Trump's fear-mongering finale, quote, the new Democrats are radical socialists who want to model America's economy after Venezuela. Venezuela is a socialist dictatorship with hyperinflation and few civil liberties. No major elected Democrats have suggested anything remotely like importing the morally and fiscally bankrupt Venezuela model to the United States. These are just a few choice nuggets of nonsense from the president's op-ed. And USA Today came under fire for publishing it. In response to the backlash, they wrote this, quote, we see ourselves as America's conversation center, presenting our readers with voices from the right, left, and middle. So far, so good. But then this. President Trump's op-ed was treated like other column submissions. We checked factual assertions while allowing authors wide leeway to express their opinions. Now, for what it's worth, I've been a columnist and editor-in-chief, and once upon a time, a speechwriter to Mayor Giuliani. There is an expectation that every fact in an op-ed is verified before submission, and then it passes a rigorous fact check by the editors before publication. And there's just no evidence that happened here. Certainly not by normal trust but verify standards. Democracy depends on a vigorous exchange of ideas, but it also depends on a fact-based debate. Or as Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan once said, everyone's entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. And that applies to the President of the United States as well. And that's your reality check.
John, I so applaud you for that reality check. USA Today, yes, they can start a conversation. They have to be journalists and fact check, as you point out. I also like the nuggets of nonsense that you just coined.
You're welcome. We're going to be serving those in the cafeteria later.
Delicious. Thank you very much. Okay, John Berman is in Panama City with the aftermath, just standing